The State of Israel is almost 70 years old, and yet big parts of the world refuse to recognize its right to exist. The alliance of Muslims, anti-Semites and regressive leftists is investing a lot of energy in undermining its legitimacy, and had been doing so for the entirety of its existence, not to mention prior to it. Realizing that they cannot completely deny the rights of Jews to live in their homeland, they have recently adopted a different tactic, and started undermining the idea of Israel as a Jewish state. By misrepresenting what the concept of a Jewish state actually means, they are trying to portray Israel as a state that is racist by definition, and use that to delegitimize it. The problem is that many people around the world, including by the way lots of Israelis and Jews, are ignorant of what the concept of the Jewish state actually means, and so they are susceptible to this manipulation. So in this video I will try to set the record straight. To show you just how much the anti-Israel crowd managed to insert their poison into the Western mind, here is Sam Harris, an honest intellectual and a Jew, showing that even he bought into their lies.
That I don't think it should exist as a Jewish state. I think the idea of a state organized around a religion is just intrinsically obnoxious and divisive and unsustainable.
So Harris thinks that Judaism is a religion, and that the definition of Israel as a Jewish state means that it is organized around this religion. After they managed to drill this misconception into the minds of even decent people, Israel's haters then claim that Israel discriminates against those who aren't of Jewish faith, and should therefore be considered an apartheid state. And that's the narrative that is being aggressively pushed today in Western academies. This is the narrative that we are here to debunk. Let's begin with the assertion that Judaism is a religion. Wrong. Judaism is first and foremost a nationality. It happens to be a nationality that has its own religion, like the English nation has the Anglican religion, but you don't have to be of Jewish faith to be considered a Jew and part of the Jewish nation. On the other hand, you can't be of Jewish faith and not be part of the Jewish nation, because, as we shall see, one of the basic tenets of the Jewish religion is that the Jews are a nation. So why do so many people think of Judaism as a religion? Well, that's due to historical reasons. The Jews originate from the kingdom of Judea, which existed for more than 1,000 years in the land of Israel. At times it was a sovereign kingdom, most of the times it was a province in one of the empires that ruled the Middle East, but it was always called Judea. That was true until the 2nd century AD, when after two big Jewish rebellions against the Roman Empire, the Romans decided they have had enough of these pesky Jews and determined to erase Judea off the map. The name of the province was changed to Palestine, and draconian measures were enforced to make life hard for the Jews, causing Jewish life in the place to dwindle. In time, Jews dispersed all over the Roman Empire, and were no longer associated with Judea. From this moment, the Jewish identity was more of a religious identity than a national identity, and the rabbis, who became the spiritual leaders of the Jews, determined that Jews must not go back to Israel and revive their nationality until the Messiah comes and brings them salvation. In this way, the rabbis ensure that they will remain in power. So the Jewish national identity became dormant, but it was not erased, because the dream of the return to Zion was preserved within the religion, waiting for the day of salvation. Jewish culture thus created many customs and rituals aimed at preserving that national identity on the ideological level, even as the Jews were religiously forbidden from realizing it on the practical level. For instance, the Jews had to pray every day, 3 times a day, a prayer called Shmona Esrei, a string of 18 prayers that include prayers that beg God to bring all the Jews back together again, to live freely in the land of Zion. This fact alone should be enough for any honest person to conclude that the Jews have always maintained their national identity, even through all those centuries of diaspora. But there have been many other customs that preserve the Jewish national identity. For instance, the Jewish holidays. If you examine the holidays of Christianity and Islam, you will see that they all celebrate things that happened to the prophets and the saints of the religion. That is because Christianity and Islam are strictly religions. Jewish holidays, on the other hand, do all, with no exception, celebrate something that happened to the Jewish nation as a whole. Every year the Jews will remind themselves that we were slaves to the Pharaoh in Egypt, that we sat in tabernacles in the desert, that we fought against the Greeks and freed our country from their rule, and so forth. With that, the Jews will reaffirm to themselves every year that they are the same nation that was exiled from Judea. Then there was the language. It is a common myth that the Jewish language was not spoken in the years of diaspora, until it was revived by the Zionists in the 19th century. This is a misconception. The Jewish language was considered holy and was not spoken as an everyday secular language, but it was still spoken in religious settings. The Jews still prayed in Hebrew, still read and discussed the religious texts in Hebrew, still wrote books and poems in the Hebrew language. Thus, they had to learn Hebrew, to know how to read and speak it. In their everyday life they spoke local dialects, but when Jewish communities from different countries wanted to communicate with each other, they would send letters written in the only language they all understood. Thus, the Hebrew language remained a vital language, a language that was still changing and growing. When the Zionists quote-unquote revived the Hebrew language, they actually only created words for everyday secular things. So Hebrew words for tomato, umbrella, sidewalk, and ice cream had to be invented, but they were invented into a language that was already being spoken and written, a language that was complete in terms of grammar and speech. Now, most nations in the world have an ethnic group at their core. The English nation, for instance, started as a group of Anglo-Saxon people, and later on they were joined by Normans, Vikings, Scots, Indians, Jamaicans, and so forth. Every time a new ethnic group joins a nation, it expands the identity of that nation and adds new things to its heritage, but it is still built around the heritage that started with the original group. The Jewish nation is no exception. It is built around the ethnic Judeans, but even in diaspora, it still managed to expand and incorporate other groups. For instance, there was the Himyar kingdom founded in the 2nd century AD in South Yemen, which converted its religion to Jewish, and after it was destroyed in the 6th century, the remaining Himyarite Jews dispersed and integrated into the Jewish communities of the Middle East and Africa. Or the Khazar kingdom that existed between the 7th and 11th century in the Caucasus, which similarly converted to Judaism and then dispersed and integrated into the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. So even in diaspora, the Jewish people managed to maintain every characteristic of an organic and viable nation. So the Jews remained a nation that existed exterritorially, carried in the minds of the Jews who kept on praying to return to Israel and be free again. When the Age of Enlightenment came, European Jews began to lose their religion, and what held them together were increasingly the ethnic ties between them. The old rabbinical decree that forbade the Jews from returning to Zion before the coming of the Messiah no longer held sway, and they began to talk about a national revival that would be brought by their own hands. The result was a Zionist movement, which was based on the demand to give the Jewish nation the same right that every other nation has, the right to live as sovereign people in their homeland. They had to fight for it, but in 1948 they managed to regain their sovereignty and form a Jewish state in the land of Israel. So Zionism at its core is an atheist movement, and when we say Jewish state, we mean Jewish in the national sense. There are some in the Israeli extreme right who give it a religious or racist interpretation, but the mainstream of both the left and the right agree on the national interpretation. Israel is a Jewish state in the same way that the US is an American state, France is a French state, and the Netherlands is a Dutch state. It has nothing to do with the Jewish religion. About 35% of Israel's citizens today are Jews who have no religion, and about 4% are Jews of Christian faith. About 20% are Palestinians, mostly of Muslim faith. Unfortunately, a big part of the world refused to accept the Jewish state, and that includes many of Israel's Palestinian citizens. To counter their attempts to undermine it, in the 1990s Israel decided to make its definition as a Jewish state official, and passed a law that asserted that you can't be elected to the Israeli Knesset if you deny Israel's definition as a Jewish democratic state. The term Jewish democratic means that the identity of the state is Jewish, but its citizens are all free to choose any identity they want. So the symbols, the national holidays, the official language, the currency, and the things Israel spends money to preserve are all based on the Jewish national heritage. But the citizens are all treated equally regardless of their identity. In that, Israel is no different from any other Western democracy. So if after hearing this somehow I still think that there's something intrinsically obnoxious and divisive about the Jewish state, you'll have to explain why you wouldn't say the same thing about the Canadian state, the Spanish state, or the Australian state. So what does that mean for the 20% of Israel's citizens who are Palestinians? Well, it means that we expect of them to become part of the Jewish nation. Just like any other country would expect any ethnic group among its citizens to become part of the nation. A Muslim Palestinian who has an Israeli citizenship should define himself as ethnically Palestinian, religiously Muslim, nationally a Jew. And of course, the Jewish identity will have to expand and include within it the Palestinian Israelis, to make their story part of our story. Unfortunately, the Palestinians continue to resist this idea, and their political leadership is actively working to ensure that they do not integrate into Israeli society. The Israeli society reacts by discriminating against them in some ways, and Israel's haters exploit that to claim that Israel is racist by definition. This is a lie. The discrimination of Israeli Palestinians does not draw its justification from the definition of Israel as a Jewish state. By definition, Israel is committed to equality. There are many people in the world today who think that we should go beyond the nation-state, that the state should simply be a mechanism that serves its citizens and does not have an identity. There are also Israelis and Palestinians who hold this notion, and argued that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be to merge Israel and Palestine into one country with no identity where Jews and Palestinians all live together. I happen to think that they are fools, because no state can ever exist without a shared national ethos that holds its citizens together. If you want Jews and Palestinians to coexist, they will have to develop such a shared national ethos, and that will take many, many decades if you start working on it now. But while I disagree with these people, I still think the view is legitimate. They have the right to argue for this solution. What is not legitimate is someone who isn't a Jew or Palestinian telling us that we should erase Israel's identity as a Jewish state and calling us racist for refusing to do so. If you want to push the world to a place that is beyond the nation states, that's your prerogative, but start with your country first. Get your American compatriots to give up teaching American history in public schools. Get your British compatriots to give up Shakespeare as their national poet and English as the official language. Get your French compatriots to give up Marianne as their national symbol or Bastille Day as their national holiday. After you finish stripping your state of all its national characteristics, then you'd be in the position to come lecture us that we should do the same. Until then, you have no right to criticize the idea of the Jewish state, or even to suggest that we should give it up. Jews are not your lab rats.